Mighty oaks from little acorns grow. Or put a different way, the greatest oaks started off as a little nut that held its ground. Welcome to 15 Minutes in the Forest. I'm Neil Clark, Forestry Extension Agent for Southeast Virginia. Today we're going to talk about how trees grow. The process that it took for this large tree back here that started out several years ago, many years ago perhaps, as a small acorn. Many millions and billions of cell divisions have happened and are happening each day within this tree. It's also interesting to know that in a large mature tree like this, probably over 75% of the mass of that tree are dead cells. All the wood inside is dead and the bark obviously is dead. So the main living cells are just the cambium and the various growing points along the leaves, twigs, branches, and roots.
These days, we all know that living things grow by cell division. All the DNA information is in each cell, but how it gets acted upon by the sunshine and gravity and other signals dictate what sort of organ those cells form, or whether it be a root, or xylem, or phloem, or a branch, or a bud, or a leaf. Those signals and the physiological arrangement of the structure determine certain things about the tree, like its shade tolerance, heat tolerance, maximum height, etc. Many trees can start from seed. Some tree seeds are large and some are very small. Different ones have adapted to be able to propagate in the environments that they are in. A seed most generally is an embryo and a food source. Angiosperms are dicots. So let's look at an acorn for an example, since it is one of the more commonly thought of tree seeds. When an acorn sprouts, the radicle emerges from the husk, or pericarp, and it grows in a downward fashion driven by chemical signals in response to gravity, response to increased moisture, and temperature difference. Once the radicle forms into roots and begins to connect to sources of water and the soil nutrients, the rest of the acorn starts the chemical response, growing cells that become cotyledons and eventually begin photosynthesis, which gives the plant's ability to convert water, nutrients, and carbon dioxide into sugars. We know that eventually trees will form the structures that we describe as roots and shoots, xylem and phloem, branches and twigs, wood and bark. But how does this occur? Each cell of a tree begins as a blank slate containing all of the components and information to become any part through various processes. We call these undifferentiated cells meristems, and they primarily occur in certain areas of the tree. These meristems are then acted upon by variations in temperature, light, chemical, and gravitational factors. Cells then differentiate themselves into xylem and phloem and other various plant structures based on these chemical determinants.
So take, for example, this cross-section of a pine tree. As you can see, out in this region is where your cambium layer would be. So there are cells within this area that are dividing mitotically, meaning they are replicating themselves into twin cells with all of the genetic information. And then over time, those cells will begin to differentiate as they neighbor into phloem variety of cells or xylem variety of cells. So these xylem cells here in this last year growth ring of early wood here, you can see some of these cells still are living and have maybe some of the cytoplasm still existing within them. Then over time, as you know, they'll thicken the walls, and over time, uh, that cell will die. Yet the skeleton, if you will, or the outside, the hardened lignin and sides of the cell wall will still remain, and so they will still conduct water, much like a straw would do, and water in an upward trajectory, primarily drawn by um, capillary force, much like a straw would do, as the leaves transpire, creates a vacuum, so to speak, and then that water um, transfers upward through the stem, even in these dead cells. Then to the outside here, you'll see phloem cells formed, and you know those would vary. See, these are forming to the inside. They are aligning uh, fairly nicely, fairly uniformly. Um, Phloem cells do stay alive, and when they um, pump the sugars, for lack of a better term, they need to do that in an active fashion. So they sort of uh, move like sponges and through other chemical signals to pass those sugars up and down and sideways to the cells that require this. So this is obviously in the um, midpoint of the stem or branch. Um, However, when you get to the leaves and smaller roots, where you have more activity in the lateral fashion, and then you see as these phloem cells um, die, they do take on different morphologies, and this is why different barks, the becomes cork on the outside here, and that's why different barks have different looks in trees. It's just the way those old phloem cells break up over time and ossify and eventually slough off.
And then each tree we speak of has a certain root shoot ratio that it is inclined to maintain. A certain amount of roots are required to support a certain number of leaves. When things below ground get out of balance, this can be seen in reduced canopy above the ground or dieback, as the root capacities are not sufficient to supply all of the canopy needs. Apical meristems are the very tips of the shoots and the roots. These elongate the plant. Lateral meristems make the tree bole larger. This is what we call the cambium. And intercalary meristems are sometimes referred to as nodes or buds, will grow into a new structure. There are different hormones or growth regulating compounds present in trees. Auxins in particular are ones that we know are synthesized in the apical meristems. Auxins trigger cell elongation and signal bud and leaf development, essentially directing which buds activate and which ones get bypassed. Synthetic auxins are used by horticulturalists to initiate root growth in order to propagate new plants from other plant cells. And other auxins are utilized in plant growth regulators, and particularly several herbicides, which is why the distorted appearance of leaves and shoots is a telltale herbicide symptom.
You can kind of see on this bald cypress here, you can see the rougher bark where last year's wood was, and then you see that there were a couple of nodes there. And the one must have been more straightforward, had more cells aligned, and took the dominant leader position. And so you see that amount of growth that
happened over 1 year, and that's of course on the side branch. And as you look up the tree, you find the main leader, and you probably have a good foot, 18 inches of growth. So same tree, obviously it's got a bigger head start as well. It's a bigger pipeline that is transporting things there. But nonetheless, the auxins and hormones inside of the tree are making that even more predominant. So as we contrast, say, that growth of the, we're talking about root to shoot, we contrast the growth of that bald cypress to this 2-year-old sweet gum stump sprout from a harvest, and you can see it's hard to even know where the node was from year 1 to 2. Rapidly growing 12, 14 foot tall in 2 years. That's a lot of auxins being delivered to one central leader. So sweet gum and a lot of your primary successional species have what's called an excurrent form, and so they do exaggerate more in the species. They respond more. That central apical meristem, that central leader, responds much more and grows straight up, and the laterals much less so. And shade tolerant species tend to grow in a more scattered or deliquescent form. When trees are grown in a group, such as a pine plantation, eventually competition will take its place, and this impacts the growth hormones within a tree. As you can see here, you have some trees that have been overtopped, and one of them has succumbed, and the other one is a very small crown and a lot of neighbors there. So over time, what happens is, you see all these lateral branches are shaded out, resulting in very few leaves contributing, and it's also getting less of those auxins that will elongate that stem, and then you get into a cycle where the tree is not providing enough food, not getting enough hormones and things to create more growing tissue, and essentially this tree will eventually be starved. Thank you for joining us for today's 15 Minutes in the Forest. Make sure you tune in on November 28th at 12:15, where Karen Snape will be doing her second series, After the Storm Disaster Response. Have a joyful journey.